Education had been problematic in Russia long before the revolutions of 1917. In 1897, during the period of Tsarist Russia, only 24% of the population was literate. Only 50% of children over the age of 8 attended school. Traditionally, basic education was under the remit of the Zemstvos and the Orthodox Church, meaning that there was very little consistency across Russia. There had been some real progress made by the state Dumas following the 1905 revolution, and elementary schooling became compulsory. By 1914, 40% of the population was literate. However, very few working class or peasant children attended high school, and very few continued education further. In 1918, the Decree on Separation of Church and State was issued, which brought schools under state control and started a wave of changes to education. Guided by the principles of Marxism, the desire to use education as a propaganda tool, and the movement of progressive education from the West, Lenin's wife, Krupskaya, laid out a plan for education in the party's programme of 1919. Number 1, the introduction of free and compulsory general and polytechnical education up to the age of 17 within the United Labour School. Number 2, the establishment of a system of preschool education to assist in the emancipation of women. Number 3, the opening of the universities and other higher institutions to working people. Number 4, the expansion of vocational training for persons from the age of 17. And number 5, the creation of a system of mass adult education combined with propaganda of communist ideas. Education was heavily influenced by the Western progressive model and the ideas of American education reformer John Dewey, who stressed learning by doing. After 1919, schools became increasingly liberal and the following reforms were introduced: no homework, no discipline or capital punishment, no examinations, no uniforms. Teachers were renamed school workers and they shared control with committees made up from older students and factory workers. The Komsomol had a more important role in maintaining standards and discipline. Likbez is an abbreviation of the Russian Likvidatsiya bez gramotnosti, which translates to the liquidation or removal of illiteracy. The Bolsheviks attached great significance to universal literacy so that all citizens could read propaganda and could learn modern industrial skills. In December 1919, the liquidation of illiteracy was decreed for all citizens between the ages of 8 to 50. It became a criminal act to refuse to learn how to read. Tens of thousands of liquidation points were set up by the Komsomol, and around 5 million people went through literacy courses. These measures had an impressive impact. 90% of people in the RSFSR were literate by 1939 and 100% by 1950. Lenin's education reforms failed, largely due to the fact that only 5% of the teachers were communist, and they struggled to teach the propaganda and had no understanding of the progressive strategies that they were being asked to use. Many continued to teach in the ways they were used to, but they had no authority without discipline. Universal schooling was prevented due to financial pressures caused by the Civil War and war communism, and as such, by 1923, only 50% of children were in school. Most of the reforms were abandoned with the introduction of the NEP in 1921. After seizing power, Stalin launched his Cultural Revolution and looked to reassert communist values in education. Once again, traditional teaching and discipline came under attack, as did textbooks, homework, and testing an individual's academic achievement. This attitude is best exemplified by the following quote from Shulgin, who was the head of an education research institute. In this quote, he describes his desire for the withering away of the school. He said, "You go into a classroom and everyone stands up. Why do they do this? Why? Well, it is the old residual past, the old dying order, the old type of relationship between adults and children, bosses and subordinates, the teacher and the pupil. An awful fart, a fart of the past. It must be driven out of the school, driven out." During the first 5-year plan, education was radically altered and focused on what was deemed to be socially useful. Rather than learning maths or reading books, children would collect firewood, teach peasants literacy, or distribute anti-religious propaganda. Higher education was narrowed so that children would only learn the most relevant industrial skills. In one school close to a chicken farm, all the children were trained to become poultry breeding technicians. In Central Asia, all children aged between 11 to 13 would be cotton pickers. This approach failed to achieve its goals, as is demonstrated by the following quote. A Central Committee resolution of August 1931 concluded that The school's basic failing is that it does not give a sufficient amount of general knowledge and does not adequately solve the problem of training fully literate persons with a good grasp of the bases of sciences, physics, chemistry, mathematics, native language, geography, and so on, for entrance into technicums and higher schools. Stalin was outraged by the state of education by 1931. There was an increased need for better educated workers, and the following measures were reintroduced: homework, uniforms, an emphasis on physics, chemistry, and maths, the authority of teachers was reasserted, and timetables were given for lessons. Education also changed to reflect the increasing Russification in the 1930s, the forcing of Russian culture onto other ethnic groups. The Russian language became compulsory from 1938, and all non-Russian languages had to use a Cyrillic-style alphabet. In 1940, Uzbek was no longer allowed to be written in Arabic characters. The study of history was also used as a weapon to promote Russian nationalism. Between 1920 and 1932, there was essentially one history textbook that was used in schools, and that was M.N. Pokrovsky's Brief History of Russia. It was a typical Marxist book and explained the entire of Russian history in the context of a class struggle leading to the 1917 revolution. It was history told from the point of view of serfs, peasants, and industrial workers. Tsars and generals were barely mentioned because they were seen to promote the idea of monarchy. Historians such as E.V. Tal, who were not Marxist and wrote histories of Peter the Great and Ivan the Terrible, were attacked and imprisoned. History was not taught in schools and throughout much of the 1920s, nor during the Cultural Revolution, because it was seen as irrelevant to industrial work. Throughout the 1920s, there were two popular first-hand accounts of the revolution: John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World and Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. These were not widely circulated after 1928, and no more Russian editions were published because Stalin was not mentioned in the books. This is a great example of Stalin's attempts to censor history. During the 1930s, Pokrovsky's history came under attack. His Marxist interpretation stated that Russian imperialism had a negative consequence on non-Russian peoples. After his death in 1932, his approach fell into official disrepute. E.V. Tal, the more traditional, patriotic Russian historian, was welcomed back out of exile and reassumed his role at the University of Moscow. During the 1930s, great Russian emperors like Peter the Great could be praised, but concepts such as monarchy, aristocracy, merchants, and the role of the church could not. Pokrovsky's Marxist history was criticised for not being patriotic enough and ignoring the role of great men in history. Stalin wanted to challenge these ideas because he wanted people to see him as a great man of history who could single-handedly drive change. Furthermore, he wanted to increase nationalist feelings to increase control over other nationalities and in light of the growth of Nazism in Europe. There was no single trend or pattern to explain how education changed between 1917 and 1941. At first, reform was incredibly liberal and followed Marxist ideology. Impressive progress was made towards eradicating illiteracy, and hundreds of thousands of people were able to attend technical universities, which they would have not been able to attend previously. However, the economic demands of the 5-year plans meant that authority had to be re-established in schools and more authoritarian measures reintroduced. By the 1930s, schools were being used as a weapon to indoctrinate children in Stalin's cult of personality and develop the ideas of Russian nationalism.